The morning air over the Ardennes felt more like glass than fog, cold, brittle, and strangely still. Near the Belgian town of St. Vith, Oberleutnant Friedrich Bahr rested his elbows on the rim of his cupola and swept his binoculars across the tree line nearly 2 miles ahead. His vehicle, King Tiger 331, sat second in a line of 6 heavy machines, each one a rolling fortress of steel. 60-plus tons, broad track marks pressed into the frozen ground, thick plates of armor angled to shrug off anything an American gun was supposed to throw at it. Exhaust drifted lazily upward, hanging in the dense air like pale banners. Inside the turret, the heater ticked quietly. The crew smelled oil, canvas, and a faint chemical trace from previous firing. Everything felt familiar. Everything felt safe. Bahr had been briefed. American tank destroyers in this sector carried 76mm guns. He had read the reports from Normandy, shells striking Panthers and Tiger eyes at range, leaving bright marks and little else. At the distances his company was operating, well beyond 2,000 yards from the last known American positions, his own front armor was effectively a wall. He knew the numbers. The frontal plate on his machine was thicker than the length of a man's hand, set at an angle that made it even harder to pierce. American gunners, he'd been told, had to close to inside 1,000 yards just to start having a chance. By then, his long 88mm could reach them several times over. He tapped the turret roof and gave the order to move. The column crept forward, engines rising to a steady, confident rumble. They were part of Kampfgruppe advancing towards St. Vith. One of the spearheads of the winter offensive Hitler had promised would change everything. Breakthrough, seize fuel, push to the Meuse. Risky, yes, but the King Tiger had been designed for exactly this kind of work. Roll through threats, ignore what bounced off, and let the gun steer the outcome. Far ahead, in the shadow of a wooded ridge, Staff Sergeant Robert Early hunched behind the periscope of a vehicle the Germans thought they knew. To any observer on the opposite slope, his machine looked like yet another American M10 tank destroyer. Slope hull, open-top turret, thin armor that relied on positioning rather than thickness. German crews had met plenty of M10s since Normandy and had learned how to handle them. Force them to move, close the distance, let the 88 do the rest. But Early's vehicle was something else. On the outside, it wore the familiar angular silhouette. Inside the turret, where it mattered, was the one detail German intelligence had missed. The gun wasn't a 76mm. Corporal James Hensley had his eye pressed to the sight, breathing calmly despite the cold that seeped into the open turret. He tracked the lead King Tiger as it emerged and disappeared in the patchy mist, the range drum ticking over as he fine-tuned the distance. The numbers settled. Range, 2700, he said into the intercom. In a regular tank destroyer, that sentence would have been a warning, not an invitation. At nearly 3,000 yards, a 76mm shell might reach the target, but would arrive with too little energy to do more than scratch and ring against that enormous frontal armor. Crews knew this. German commanders knew this. Tactics on both sides had ossified around these limitations. But the long barrel protruding from Early's turret was different. The 90mm gun lurking there had been designed for a very different job and brought its original job's energy into this new one. Lead tank, center of mass, 2700, Early said quietly. Identified, Hensley replied. Fire. The turret filled with a deep mechanical bark and a brief flash as the 90mm sent a 24-pound projectile into the grey morning. The whole vehicle rocked backward slightly, the recoil system doing its best to turn raw force into something the chassis could tolerate. The round left the muzzle faster than sound, carving through the cold air in barely more than 3 seconds. In King Tiger 331, Bahr had just lowered his binoculars when something hard struck the turret front near the junction with the ring. There was no time for calculations. No chance to reason through what was happening. One moment the vehicle was untouchable on paper. The next, that assumption no longer existed. To the German column, it felt like the horizon had suddenly learned a new trick. Hit, Hensley reported, voice flat, as the loader jammed another long shell into the breach. Early didn't linger on the sight picture. His gaze was already shifting, searching the columns of exhaust and dark shapes behind the lead tank. On the German net, confusion came first, then disbelieving anger. Someone shouted for artillery. Someone else insisted an unseen heavy gun must be dug in along the ridge. The idea that a mobile vehicle nearly 3 kilometers away had just opened them like a tin can wasn't merely unexpected. It fell outside the mental map most of them were using to survive this war. The rest of the engagement would play out over minutes, but the mental shock landed in seconds. A machine that doctrine, math, and experience all said was safe at this distance had been taken out from a place no one had flagged as dangerous. What happened on that ridge near St. Vith wasn't just a lucky shot. It was the frontline debut of a weapon system the Germans had technically photographed, sketched, and even captured, but never truly believed. To see how a gun that first existed to shoot down high-altitude aircraft became the quiet nemesis of Germany's heaviest tanks, we have to step backward half a year, to hedgerows and dirt roads very far from the winter forests of the Ardennes. Because the story of the M36 Jackson doesn't start in snow. It starts in the maze of Normandy, where American tank crews learned, very quickly and very painfully, that the guns they had were no longer enough. In June 1944, when American forces fought their way off the beaches of Normandy, their training still belonged to a different war. Tank gunners had drilled against silhouettes of Panzer III and Panzer IV, medium vehicles with armor measured in a couple of inches, vertical plates that a 75mm shell could defeat at what manuals called normal combat ranges. They were told that if they saw German armor first and got the first shot, they had a fair chance of coming out ahead. Then the bocage swallowed those expectations. The hedgerows, dense, ancient earthworks crowned with brush and trees, turned every field into a compartment, every lane into a blind corner. Engagements happened at odd angles, along narrow lines of sight. And in those restricted views, new shapes began to appear. The Panther's long, sharp-nosed hull and sloping glacis looked almost elegant in still photographs. Under fire, the design felt less like elegance and more like mockery. American crews watched armor-piercing rounds strike the front, shatter, and bounce away at distances where training had promised reliable results. Reports began to come in. Multiple hits, no penetration, front armor resistant at expected ranges. Then there were encounters with Tiger I, taller, boxier, carrying even more thickness up front. For crews used to engaging earlier German tanks, it felt like someone had quietly moved the goalposts several yards down the field. And as if that weren't enough, Allied intelligence began whispering about something heavier still. The Tiger II, what Allied soldiers would christen the King Tiger, slowly entered the vocabulary, not as a routine contact but as the sort of thing that shaped whole plans. Its armor scheme stretched the trend to its logical extreme. Very thick, angled at challenging slopes, built to flatten the odds. The tanks themselves weren't omnipresent. There were never that many of them. But their influence was out of proportion to their numbers. Stories moved faster than vehicles. A single King Tiger appearing on a road line and scattering lighter tanks could echo all along a front, reshaping how crews interpreted every silhouette in the distance. On the American side, tank destroyer units were supposed to be the answer to heavy German armor. The concept had been clear on paper: keep fast-gunned vehicles in reserve, rush them to meet armored thrusts, use mobility and firepower to blunt the attack. The M10 Wolverine carried a 3-inch gun. The M18 Hellcat was quicker still, able to sprint along roads at speeds unheard of for an armored track vehicle. But in the confined, uneven terrain of Normandy, speed was a promise the ground couldn't always keep. Crews rarely had the luxury of long runs on good roads. Instead, they navigated narrow lanes, farm tracks, and churned fields, where a broken hedge or hidden ditch could erase any paper advantage. And the 76mm and 3-inch guns themselves were running into the same problem as the Sherman's 75mm, a ceiling they could not push past. At under 1,000 yards, with careful aim and the right ammunition, they could hurt a Panther frontally. Against a Tiger I, they needed either the right angle or closer distance. Against the Tiger II's front plates, crews quickly learned that their shots were acts of hope more than reliable solutions. It wasn't just a physical issue. Sitting in a vehicle you know cannot reliably affect the enemy at the range he prefers to fight. It changes everything. Veteran destroyer crews began to talk not just about tactics, but about morale, that quiet calculus each crewman runs in his head about what is and isn't possible when metal starts moving toward them. Messages reflecting this reality began climbing upward. After-action reports from tank destroyer battalions described shells that left bright scars on German armor without making it combat ineffective. Commanders described crews abandoning vehicles when very heavy German tanks appeared, reasoning, correctly, that staying in place meant being targeted by guns that outranged and outmatched theirs. In offices far from the hedgerows, those reports turned into underlined sentences and red question marks. The question was stark. If the main anti-tank guns in theatre could no longer be counted on to stop the heaviest German armor at typical engagement distances, what could? The answer, it turned out, was already in uniform, but pointing in a very different direction. Across American airfields and coastal forts, long-barreled 90mm anti-aircraft guns pointed at the sky, not at fields. Their crews drilled on calculating lead and altitude, not on estimating the thickness of armor. To most ground soldiers, they were simply part of the distant umbrella meant to discourage enemy bombers. Inside ordnance files, though, some people had been paying attention to numbers that didn't care whether the target had wings or tracks. A 90mm shell left the barrel at very high velocity. It needed to. Climbing up to meet fast aircraft required energy. A heavy projectile moving that fast carried a lot of potential, and potential doesn't vanish just because the gun barrel gets aimed closer to the horizon. Someone, sometime in the late 1930s and early 1940s, had put these thoughts together. They weren't proposing a miracle weapon, they were following the math. A gun powerful enough to reach high-flying aircraft with meaningful effect would, by definition, be capable of punching through thick steel at comparatively short distances. The question was no longer, is this gun powerful enough? It was, can we bring that power onto a mobile chassis without breaking everything around it? That problem, the engineering, not the ballistics, would lead to a strange, almost accidental form of camouflage. And it would set the stage for a vehicle that could look completely ordinary while doing something very few on the battlefield believed it could do. Turning a heavy anti-aircraft gun into something a tank destroyer crew could live with wasn't as simple as bolting a barrel onto whatever hull happened to be nearby. The 90mm weapon system weighed significantly more than the gun's American crews were used to. It generated more recoil, required more space to move through its range of elevation, and brought with it a longer, heavier barrel that threatened to unbalance any turret not designed specifically to carry it. Early experiments in 1943 explored different combinations. Engineers tried mock-ups on standard Sherman hulls, experimented with different mounts, and ran into the same repeating set of obstacles. Too much stress on existing turret rings, too much strain on suspensions not rated for the added weight, and stability issues when firing at the extremes of traverse. The breakthrough came when designers stopped trying to shoehorn the gun into an old layout, and instead treated it as the central fact around which everything else had to be built. American tank destroyer doctrine already favored open-top turrets as a way to save weight and keep silhouettes relatively low. By accepting that the crew would fight under the sky, rather than under a roof of armor, engineers bought back precious weight in the overall design. That weight could be redirected into a stronger turret ring, support structures for the heavier recoil system, and ammunition storage for the larger rounds. The M10's hull, essentially a modified Sherman chassis, provided a familiar platform. Mechanics in the field already knew how to maintain it. Supply chains were already feeding its engines and tracks. If the new gun system could be made to work on that base, the logistics problem would be more manageable. So a new turret was drawn up, larger in diameter, open at the top, with a prominent counterweight at the rear to balance the long barrel of what would be designated the 90mm M3 gun. The prototype vehicles carried the somewhat bureaucratic label of 90mm gun motor carriage T-71. Soldiers would not call it that for long. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, crews and engineers stepped through live-fire tests. Heavy steel plates stood in for enemy armor. At 1,000 yards, the 90mm standard armor-piercing rounds punched through thicknesses that existing guns could not reliably defeat. At 2,000 yards, the results were still impressive, particularly against vertical or moderately inclined plates. Plotted on charts, the curves of penetration versus distance diverged sharply from the 76mm. Numbers are one thing. The sensation of firing is another. Test crews remarked on the weighty feel of the gun cycle, the deep mechanical thump of the recoil, and the way the vehicle rocked yet returned to position. They also noted that the basics, the breech operation, the sights, the loading rhythm, were close enough to existing tank destroyers that experienced crews wouldn't have to relearn their entire craft. The open turret remained a calculated compromise. Without overhead armor, the crew would always be vulnerable to airburst artillery, mortar fragments dropping from above, and small arms fire from higher ground. On the other hand, the lack of a roof gave better visibility, more room to handle the long shells, and kept the weight under a level the chassis could handle. What no one deliberately planned, but later turned out to be crucial, was how much the overall vehicle looked like its predecessor. From the side, at any reasonable combat distance, the new turret resembled an M10's, angular, open, and mounted on a hull with the same fundamental shape. To the eye of a reconnaissance pilot taking quick photographs, or to a German commander glimpsing silhouettes across a valley, it might as well have been the same machine. Only the barrel length and thickness truly gave it away, details that could easily be lost in haze, distance, or simple human inattention. By March 1944, The new design had passed enough tests to shed its prototype designation. Production orders began to flow toward plants already pressing steel into tanks around the clock. One of them, Fisher Body's tank division in the Detroit area, took on the task of turning the paper concept into metal at speed. The vehicle received a formal designation that hinted at continuity rather than revolution. M36, a tank destroyer, not a radical new category. Crews would soon give it the informal name Jackson, though that nickname would never be official. On the shop floor, welders and fitters focused on their portion of the job. A turret here, a gun mount there, married to hulls that were cousins of machines already on the lines. Unlike Germany's late war projects, exotic, expensive, produced in smaller numbers, this new weapon was being woven into an industrial system already humming at scale. On paper, the M36 was a straightforward answer to a specific tactical need: more firepower at longer range. In practice, circumstances would give it an additional, unintended strength: anonymity. When the first M36S rolled down ramps in French ports in the early autumn of 1944, no bands played, no special briefings announced their arrival to the wider army. They were simply new vehicles on the manifest, needed replacements for units that had been grinding forward since June. Their crews would discover what they could do in training fields and then, very quickly, in real engagements. Their opponents would discover, to their cost, that their own data about American capabilities was now subtly and fatally wrong. By October 1944, the war in Western Europe had shifted from the countryside of France to the tougher, narrower terrain of Germany's frontier. Forests thickened, towns grew denser, and defensive lines hardened. American units that had raced across open fields in late summer now found themselves fighting village by village and ridge by ridge. The 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, like many such units, had been in almost constant motion since Normandy. Its crews had lived through the awkward reality of seeing their 3-inch guns struggle against the best German armor. They had learned to aim for flanks, seek compromise angles, and call for artillery or air support when very heavy tanks appeared. When a batch of their aging M10S was taken away and replaced with unfamiliar vehicles sporting longer barrels, the mood in the motor pool mixed curiosity with a practical question: would this really make things different? Training officers gathered crews at makeshift ranges behind the lines. They explained the basics: same general hull, new turret, new gun. The 90mm cartridges were heavier and longer than the 76mm rounds they were used to, but the loading routine remained natural enough. One man hauled shells from racks, another eased them into the breech with practice movements. The gunner made fine adjustments on familiar controls. The key was not in how the gun worked, but in where it was supposed to be used. Official instructions that accompanied the new vehicles were clear and, for tank destroyer crews who had lived through Normandy, almost startling: engage heavy German armor at the greatest practical distance. Do not close unless forced. Use terrain and concealment to fire from well beyond the range at which earlier guns had been effective. During range practice, gunners walked their sights onto old hulks and steel targets set far farther out than they were used to. The first time a 90mm round punched through a plate at a range where the old guns would have simply left a bright mark, crews exchanged glances that didn't need words. Range estimation, already a critical skill, took on a new flavor. The difference between 1,500 and 2,200 yards was no longer just a matter of comfort. It was the difference between meeting a heavy tank where it expected to be safe and being forced into a zone where its gun reigned supreme. At the same time, crews were warned about something they were not to talk about: the fact that, to anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for, their new vehicles still looked like older M10S. The implication was simple: if German units believed they were dealing with the familiar 76mm, they would behave according to that belief. And behavior, at this stage of the war, mattered as much as armor thickness. The first opportunity to test this new equation came in the wooded hills east of Aachen. On a chilly October morning, an M36 platoon of the 702nd took up concealed positions along a tree-lined ridge overlooking a patchwork of fields and gentle slopes. Below, German armor, a mix of Panthers and Panzer IVs, began a probing advance, using hedgerows and shallow folds in the ground for partial cover. In earlier months, an M10 crew might have waited, let the German tanks roll closer until their own guns had a decent chance of doing more than cosmetic damage, then tried to pick off lead and trail vehicles to stall the advance. It was a risky dance that required nerves of steel. This time, the platoon leader issued a different set of orders. Rangers were called out at distances that still felt almost unnervingly long. Gunners set their sights, watched the oscillating silhouettes through mile haze, and fired. One Panther, then another, then a third, came to a sudden, unnatural stop before they were within what German crews thought of as the real fight distance. From the German perspective, the hits seemed to land from nowhere, too flat and precise to be indirect artillery, too distant to fit their mental picture of American tank destroyer fire. In their logs, German units described such engagements as being under fire from well-sighted, dug-in anti-tank guns or field pieces. The idea that mobile tank destroyers had reached out from concealment at that range simply did not match their catalogue of known threats. For the M36 crews, the takeaway was both straightforward and profound. The guns did what the charts had promised. But more importantly, their opponents were reacting as if some unseen, static weapon had ambushed them, not as if nimble vehicles could relocate between shots. As October turned into November, scattered across the front, M36S repeated this pattern. Sometimes shots missed. Sometimes weather or terrain forced closer engagements, where the thin armor of the tank destroyers again felt like a liability. But enough long-range successes accumulated that commanders began to think of the 90mm destroyers not as slightly improved M10S, but as fundamentally new tools. Word of their existence, however, did not spread at the same rate on the other side of the lines. German infantry saw American vehicles with the familiar angular profiles and noted M10. Liaison officers recorded the same type in daily tallies. Aerial reconnaissance, snapping quick photographs of parking areas and columns, marked them accordingly on their overlays. Some analysts in German intelligence circles noticed that a few of these M10S had slightly different turrets or marginally longer barrels. In margin notes on internal documents, cautious phrases appeared, possible new variant. Under the pressure of relentless operations on multiple fronts, those notes rarely made it into the main text. On the ground, for crews like Early's, the situation felt simpler. They had something that worked at a range where the old guns had not. They knew they were supposed to use it before the enemy closed. And, as the year moved toward its coldest days, the heaviest German tanks were being gathered for one last major gamble, still trusting in armor calculations that no longer fully matched reality. To understand why German intelligence missed what was, in hindsight, hiding in plain sight, it helps to imagine their war rooms in late 1944. Maps of Europe were crowded with colored pins. On one wall, reports from the Eastern Front, Soviet breakthroughs, withdrawals, desperate counterattacks. On another, summaries from Italy and the Balkans. The Western Front added its own dense layer of arrows and notes. Every day, radio messages, courier packets, and photographs arrived in stacks. In that flood of information, the job of analysts in the section responsible for tracking enemy equipment, particularly foreign armies in the West, was to find patterns and signal among the noise. For years, they had built a detailed catalogue of Allied machines, updating silhouettes, armament data, and approximate production counts. The American M10 was well known. Open-top turret, 3-inch or 76mm gun, relatively thin armor. The M18 Hellcat had also been identified. Lower profile, faster, similar gun. The Sherman tank, in its many variants, was familiar enough by this stage to be almost routine. When a Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft flew over a rear area in Belgium or France and photographed a cluster of American tank destroyers in a muddy field, the images went first to photo interpreters. These specialists zoomed in on blurry shapes, drew outlines, and compared them to reference books. If the hull shape matched an M10 and the turret looked open and angular, the simplest conclusion was that these were M10S. In one now faded image, taken over a Belgian village motor park in November, for tank destroyers stand in a line near a hedgerow. To modern eyes, with the ability to pause and zoom, it's just possible to see that the turrets are slightly bulkier than those of early production M10S and that the barrels seem longer. At the time, the interpreter added a note: self-propelled anti-tank guns, likely M10. Turrets appear modified, possible subtype. That cautious possible stayed in the margin. In the processed summary sent upward, the vehicles were simply counted as M10S. The change in gun caliber, from 76mm to 90mm, was never explicitly considered. The mental model still said, American mobile anti-tank weapons, maximum of 76mm. Anything heavier must either be towed artillery or static fortifications. Meanwhile, German frontline officers were filing their own observations. In several sectors, panzer units reported vehicles being hit and disabled at unexpectedly long ranges by direct-fire weapons. Some tank commanders noted the flat trajectory and speed of the incoming rounds, suggesting a high-velocity gun, yet when they tried to match this with known American systems, The closest fit they could find were heavy-towed guns or British 17-pounders. The instinct to fit new data into familiar categories is powerful. When a Panther was struck frontally at what should have been a safe distance, and the crew saw no obvious American self-propelled guns nearby, the easiest explanation was that some well-camouflaged anti-tank gun had been rolled into place. In one sector, an armored company that lost several vehicles in quick succession at long range filed an urgent note up the chain of command. The officer suggested that American forces might be fielding improved ammunition in existing guns, perhaps captured tungsten cord rounds, rather than new vehicles. He recommended more cautious movement and increased reconnaissance, but did not propose revising the fundamental assumption about enemy gun calibers. Occasionally, reality pushed harder. In early December, after a mine disabled one track of an American tank destroyer near a German village, its crew had to abandon it under pressure. They damaged what they could and withdrew. When German forces secured the area, they found the vehicle largely intact. Technical teams arrived with measuring tapes and notebooks. They checked the barrel's interior diameter, 90 millimeters. They opened ammunition stowage and examined the large cartridges, each clearly stamped with size markings. They walked around the hull and turret, noting how closely its overall outline resembled the familiar M10, and how deceptive that similarity was. Over the next days, a detailed technical report was compiled, drawings of the turret layout, notes on armor thickness, estimates of gun performance based on impact marks observed on nearby ruined German vehicles. The conclusion was unambiguous. The Americans were operating a mobile 90mm tank destroyer on a familiar chassis. Under normal circumstances, such a report would have been quickly summarized and sent to relevant field commands with an updated equipment bulletin. By December 1944, circumstances were anything but normal. Berlin was under frequent attack from the air. Ministries were splitting, relocating staff to safer locations and trying to salvage files under pressure. The weapons office charged with evaluating captured enemy equipment was in the middle of packing crates for transfer. The captured vehicle report, thoroughly prepared and neatly bound, was placed into one of these crates. The crate was shipped out with many others. It would be weeks before anyone opened it again. On the front, Panzer units continued to plan their operations using the best information they thought they had. That information still said, American tank destroyer guns, 76mm at most. At the same time, American battalions were quietly replacing older M10S with M36S in key sectors. The lines on the map that separated safe distance from danger zone had shifted. One side knew. The other did not. And in mid-December, with snow in the woods and fuel in carefully hidden tanks, German planners set in motion an offensive that depended, in no small part, on their heavy armor reaching key road junctions while still feeling untouchable. The Ardennes in December 1944 looked, at first glance, like a place where nothing decisive would happen. Rolling forests, small villages, winding roads barely wide enough for 2 trucks to pass, hardly ideal terrain for sweeping armored operations. That perception was part of the reason Allied planners believed the area could be held with relatively thin forces. Veteran divisions were resting elsewhere or pushing on other axes. Newer units, still settling into the realities of frontline service, were assigned to this quiet sector. Artillery coverage was patchy. Tank destroyer battalions and armored units were present, but not in overwhelming numbers. On the German side, that quiet made the Ardennes attractive for a different reason. Hitler's winter plan, the operation that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, hinged on surprise. If armored spearheads could punch through thin American lines, seize key crossroads at places like St. Vith and Bastogne, and reach river crossings before the Allies fully reacted, there might, in theory, be an opportunity to split British and American forces and force a pause in the advance. To support this gamble, Germany gathered some of its best remaining armor. Panthers and Panzer IVs from experienced divisions would form much of the striking force. But the heaviest weight, literally and figuratively, would be carried by the King Tigers of special heavy battalions, units that, on paper, could break open almost any defensive line they encountered, as long as fuel and bridges held. In the days before the offensive, briefings to these heavy tank crews repeated familiar themes: frontal armor resistant to American guns at typical ranges, great care required to avoid mines and air attack, importance of maintaining momentum to exploit shock. The newly produced King Tigers rolled towards staging areas, engines gulping fuel that staff officers had rationed more carefully than almost any other resource. On the American side of the lines, commanders did not know the exact scale of the coming attack, but they did know that heavy German armor was present in theater and that road junctions in the Ardennes were vulnerable points. Among the reinforcement decisions made in late autumn was the placement of tank destroyer battalions equipped with M36s near likely axes of approach. At St. Vith, the town where so many small roads knotted together, elements of the 7th Armoured Division, infantry units, and the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion began to improvise a defensive network as reports of German movement filtered in. When the snow came, it muted colours and sound, adding another layer of concealment to terrain that already favoured those who could fire unseen. Staff Sergeant Early and his crew received their orders in the pre-dawn dimness: move to a ridge line covering a key approach, dig in as much as time allowed, and be ready to engage armour at long range. The instructions matched the doctrine that had been quietly developing around the M36. Do not wait to fight heavy tanks up close. If you can see them early, you can hurt them early. The hull of the destroyer settled into a shallow scrape. Snow and brush were pulled around the front to break up its outline. Only the upper portion of the turret and the long barrel remained exposed, disguised as best the crew could manage with branches and the forgiving distortion of fog. Around them, other M36s in the platoon did the same, spaced along the ridge so that overlapping arcs of fire covered the open ground below. Infantry in foxholes and machine gun nests added another layer of defense. When the German artillery barrage that opened the offensive fell elsewhere along the line, shaking the earth with its intensity, the ridge near St. Vith remained relatively untouched for the moment. Early's crew listened to the distant rumble, checked ammunition stowage, and ran through mental checklists. The loader touched each row of long brass cases, counting quietly. The gunner adjusted his sight controls, rehearsing the motions he would make when told to fire. By mid-morning on the 19th, German armour emerging from the woods east of St. Vith began to funnel toward the road that passed through the town. Among them rolled Barr's King Tigers, heavy tracks grinding over frozen ground, smaller vehicles moving around them like escorts. The heavy tank's presence projected confidence. To crews who had survived months of fighting, the thick, angled plates were not just metal. They were a promise that as long as they followed drill and avoided obvious dangers, they could ride through most threats. The landscape ahead seemed to support that promise.
No obvious bunkers.
No strong concrete line. Only gently rising ground and a tree line somewhere ahead. In the M36, the sight picture looked very different. Through Early's periscope and Hensley's telescopic view, the German column appeared as dark, slow-moving shapes against the pale snow, partially masked by fog. Range flags in their heads went up automatically. Far, but not too far. The numbers matched the training ranges they had walked through only weeks earlier. Lead vehicle, heavy type, 3000, came the first quiet range estimate. The temptation, drilled into many gunners by earlier machines, would have been to wait, to let the enemy come closer, to reduce uncertainty. But the whole point of the 90mm gun was to invert that instinct. The tactical advantage came specifically from engaging at distances where German crews believed they were safe. So the platoon leader gave the order to fire. Early's M36 and its neighbours began a deliberate process they had practiced but never yet executed against such high-value targets at such ranges. Acquire, adjust, fire, observe, shift. The initial shots, including the one that tore apart Barr's King Tiger, were not wild gambles but calculated risks backed by charts and experience. Each hit sent a message the receiving crews were not prepared to read. In moments, the attack axis that German planners had expected their heaviest tanks to dominate had turned into something else entirely. A long, exposed corridor overlooked by guns with better reach than anyone on that side of the front had allowed for. The true damage would go beyond the burning or disabled vehicles left in the snow. It would seep into the way commanders approached every road, every suspected American position, for the rest of the campaign. But that shift in thinking would take time. For now, in the cold morning near St. Vith, the shock was immediate and very local. The first seconds after a sudden loss in battle, often filled with questions that have no time to be answered. In the King Tiger behind bars, the commander craned out of his cupola, searching for the source of the strike that had just removed the lead vehicle from the column as if a giant hand had reached down and plucked it away. He saw only the ghost of rising smoke and, beyond it, the familiar ridge line. Training and doctrine supplied the most likely causes: a heavy anti-tank gun carefully sighted in the woods, or perhaps a field gun brought forward and dug in. In either case, the standard response had been taught and rehearsed: close the distance quickly, bring the tank's own gun to bear, and crush the threat with speed and fire. So he ordered his driver forward. On the ridge, Early watched through his periscope as the second King Tiger picked up speed, the change of posture easy to see even through the mist. The loader had already rammed another 90mm round into the breech. The gunner made a minor adjustment. Second vehicle, closing. 2500. On, Hensley murmured. Fire. The next shot went out, once again exploiting a range band that existed, for this German crew, somewhere between theory and myth. The round struck low on the frontal armor. Even at that distance and angle, the energy transfer was enough to transform the crew's confidence in their front plate into something far less solid. Within seconds, what had been an orderly advance became a series of disjointed movements. Some tanks stopped. Others tried to angle their armor toward the invisible threat. Infantry accompanying the columns sought cover in roadside ditches and behind whatever solid objects they could find. What made the situation harder for the German side was that every frame of reference they had for American firepower told them they should not be in real danger yet. The distances, the lack of visible muzzle flashes, the deceptive familiarity of the silhouettes on the ridge line, all combined to create an impression of being targeted by something that didn't quite fit any known category. The other M36s in the platoon added their own contributions. Firing in turn or in quick succession, shifting aim from one target to another, they created the illusion of a network of static guns rather than a small group of mobile vehicles that could, in principle, relocate between volleys. German artillery observers, hearing urgent calls over the radio about unknown guns on the ridge, began to direct fire onto the coordinates given. Shells fell on the positions where the M36s had just been. As soon as the first rounds landed, the tank destroyers backed out of their shallow scrapes, moved along pre-planned paths in the trees, and set up again several hundred yards away, ready to repeat the cycle if another push came. From the German side, the puzzle only deepened. Reports described heavy direct-fire weapons, high-velocity hits from long range, and strong resistance from unseen positions. Some officers hypothesized that the Americans had brought forward larger towed guns than previously thought, perhaps even dual-purpose pieces repurposed from anti-aircraft duties. The possibility that these effects were coming from vehicles that could shift position as easily as their own tanks did not yet feel real. The engagement at St. Vith was not the only place where this misalignment between perception and reality played out. Farther north, near the Elsenborn Ridge, M36s worked in concert with infantry and artillery to blunt attacks by other panzer formations. Here too, German crews found themselves under precise, flat trajectory fire at ranges beyond the comfort zone their charts had defined. When Panthers and King Tigers tried to close, they entered zones covered by artillery and other defensive fires. The combination slowed what was supposed to be a rapid advance into something more cautious and fragmented. Near Bastogne, in the days when that town's name was still becoming a symbol, tank destroyer units equipped with M36s used wooded positions to pick off leading German tanks before they could bring their full weight to bear on the besieged perimeter. Again, the pattern repeated: long-range hits, ambiguous sources, and an enemy puzzled by the mismatch between what he expected American guns to do and what they were actually doing. In all these cases, the M36 did not fight alone, nor did its crews see themselves as wielding a secret instrument that would decide the entire battle. They were part of a larger defensive system that included infantry holding crossroads, engineers blowing bridges, and artillery batteries shifting fire as calls came in. Yet their particular contribution, the ability to damage or disable the most heavily armored German vehicles before those vehicles could confidently bring their own strengths to bear, had an outsized effect on how quickly German attacks could build momentum. It would take weeks, and the gradual collation of many such reports, before German intelligence formally updated its view of what American tank destroyers could do. By then, the winter offensive had lost its drive, the bulge in the line had begun to shrink, and the weather had cleared enough for Allied aircraft to return to the skies in numbers that made any large armored movement risky. For now, in late December 1944, confusion was as much a weapon as steel. The King Tiger, designed to make others feel uncertain and overmatched, was itself moving in a field where the ground rules had quietly changed. When the crates containing the captured vehicle report finally arrived at their new destination in January 1945, the staff opening them were more concerned with keeping paperwork in some kind of order than with the specific contents of each bundle. Even so, the M36 report stood out. Detailed sketches, clear photographs of the turret interior and exterior, measurements of barrel length and diameter, notes on ammunition type and markings. It was the sort of comprehensive technical dossier that weapon analysts valued. The conclusions were blunt. This American tank destroyer carried a 90mm gun with performance comparable to Germany's own long 88mm. Its armor was comparatively light. Its silhouette nearly matched that of previously known M10 vehicles. The recommendation was clear as well. Field commands needed to be informed that a mobile 90mm threat existed and that existing assumptions about safe engagement ranges should be revised. An equipment bulletin went out. It bore a date in the first week of January and a distribution list that included panzer divisions on the Western Front. The text described the M36, noted its similar appearance to the M10, and warned that at ranges where crews had once considered themselves relatively secure, they might now be within reach of this new gun. By the time these bulletins were read in forward headquarters, the situation at the front had shifted dramatically. The German advance in the Ardennes had stalled. At many points it had been halted entirely. Fuel shortages, stubborn resistance at key towns and road junctions, and the return of Allied air power had turned what began as a bold thrust into a draining defense. Armored units that had entered the offensive at near full strength had left many vehicles behind, some ruined, some abandoned for lack of fuel or repair, some stuck in terrain that had turned from frozen solid to muddy trap as temperatures fluctuated. For crews who had survived both the initial offensive and the subsequent retreat, reading that American mobile guns could reach out as far as their own long 88s may have felt less like a revelation and more like a belated confirmation of something they had already suspected. Those strange long-range hits, the armor penetrations at distances that felt wrong, the moments when tanks were knocked out before they could even bring their own guns fully to bear, now there was a label for it. Tactically, German units tried to adapt. Guidance emphasized using terrain more carefully, avoiding long, exposed approaches where enemy guns might find them at a distance, and coordinating more closely with reconnaissance elements. Heavy tanks were increasingly used as anchor points in prepared defenses, covering narrower sectors where fields of fire and threats could be better controlled. In some ways, this represented an inversion of the role the King Tiger had been intended to play. Instead of leading thrusts into enemy positions, they were becoming expensive, immobile, or semi-mobile strongpoints, husbanded for last-ditch holds and counterstrokes. From the American perspective, as winter turned slowly toward spring, the M36's presence across the front became easier to see in aggregated data. Battalions that had converted to the 90mm destroyers reported higher success rates against medium and heavy German tanks when they could set up engagements on their own terms. Kill claims and after-action sketches lay over maps like a series of sharp pins marking where German armor had attempted to resist and been forced back. Yet the M36's utility was not simply in how many tanks it helped remove from the field. It was in how its existence, once recognized, made German planners more cautious about using armor as an aggressive tool in the West. A captured Panther commander, interrogated after being taken prisoner in early 1945, described the feeling this way to his American questioners. Before, we thought, if we stay at 2 kilometers, we are reasonably safe from most of your guns. After the winter offensive, it was different. We assumed something out there could reach us, even if we could not see it. That changes how you look at every ridge. At the same time, American crews themselves did not usually frame their experiences in such abstract terms. For many tank destroyer soldiers, the war remained stubbornly immediate. Orders received, positions occupied, targets engaged, friends lost, new faces joining the crew. The M36 was, to them, the vehicle they happened to be in when those things happened. They noticed its quirks, the way the long gun shifted the balance on rough ground, the vulnerability of the open turret to bad weather and falling fragments, the extra strain of hauling heavier rounds. They also noticed its strengths, the steadiness of the platform under fire, the authority of its main gun when a shot landed where it was meant to. In the Rhineland battles that followed the Bulge, these traits played out again and again. Across flat farmland, through small towns lined with stone houses, along riverbanks, M36s took on German armor that was often fighting a delaying action. In one sector, a platoon of M36s covered an infantry advance toward a village where German tanks were dug in among buildings. Using the longer reach of their guns, they engaged from positions outside the main built-up area, trading fire with enemy vehicles that had to expose at least part of themselves to get an angle. The detailed reports from such fights rarely used grand language. They spoke in terms of yards, approximate headings, types of enemy vehicles, and ammunition expended. Only much later would historians gather those small notations into a broader picture. By then, the M36 itself was already on the path from cutting edge to merely adequate. As the war in Europe moved into its final months, the character of armored combat changed perceptibly. Large, sweeping maneuvers by intact panzer divisions became rarer. Instead, scattered groups of German tanks and self-propelled guns fought local actions, often in support of infantry trying to hold provisional lines or withdraw in better order. For M36 crews, this meant fewer set-piece confrontations with entire companies of heavy tanks and more unpredictable engagements in villages, at river crossings, or at the edges of forests. The long 90mm gun remained valuable, but the range at which it was used often shrank simply because terrain or visibility limited what could be seen. The statistical record compiled after the war indicated that M36s were credited with several hundred German armoured vehicles destroyed or disabled between their introduction and the end of hostilities in Europe. Medium tanks made up the bulk of that tally, with heavy tanks, including King Tigers, forming a notable portion. Yet even these numbers, impressive as they are, tell only part of the story. In many engagements, the presence of M36s influenced enemy choices without a shot necessarily being fired. German units that had learned to respect the 90mm's reach were more reluctant to use open ground, more inclined to fall back from positions that might be pre-sighted, and more likely to devote scarce artillery shells to suppressing suspected tank destroyer positions. On the psychological level, this reinforced a trend that had been growing since the autumn of 1944, the erosion of the aura of invulnerability that had once surrounded certain German vehicles. Early in the war, Allied crews had often looked at photographs of German heavy tanks with a kind of wary fascination. The Tiger, in particular, had entered popular and professional imagination as something close to a land battleship. Stories of Shermans needing to swarm such tanks to defeat them circulated widely. By late 1944 and early 1945, that relationship had shifted. With new guns in service and more experience under their belts, American crews did not see a King Tiger and think unreachable. They saw it as a priority but not as an impossibility. This change in attitude mattered. A crew that believes it has a fair chance of affecting a target behaves differently under pressure than one that believes it is facing something completely outside its capacity. The M36 contributed to that change by giving its crews a tool that, under the right conditions, could reach and neutralize the heaviest armor Germany could field. On the German side, the same shift was playing out in reverse. Where King Tigers had once rolled onto battlefields with the expectation that most enemy rounds would fail to do more than inconvenience them at long range, commanders now had to assume that some of those distant flashes represented threats equivalent in power to their own guns. One armoured officer, reflecting after the war in an interview, summarized it in simple terms: "We used to think, if we can see them, we can deal with them before they harm us." Later, it became, "If we can see them, they might already be able to harm us." That is a different feeling entirely. Looking back, military analysts often highlight the lessons of the M36 story not primarily as a case of technical innovation, but as an example of how intelligence frameworks can lag behind reality. German intelligence did not fail to collect information. They photographed M36s, captured one, examined its ammunition, and received multiple frontline reports of long-range hits that contradicted their previous understanding. The failure lay in how quickly and effectively they incorporated that information into doctrine and practice. By the time the existence of a mobile 90mm American tank destroyer was formally acknowledged and broadcast to field units, the window in which that knowledge could have significantly altered the course of a major offensive had closed. Historians draw parallels to other moments where armies clung to outdated assumptions even as contradictory evidence mounted. Pre-war beliefs about where tanks could and couldn't operate. Misplaced confidence in fixed fortifications. Dismissal of early signs of new enemy tactics. In each case, the technical details differ, but the underlying pattern remains similar. On the Allied side, the M36 also illustrated a different kind of lesson, that an industrial system capable of adapting existing technologies quickly can produce practical, if not perfect, solutions in the middle of a conflict. The 90mm gun had not been invented from scratch for this purpose. It had been repurposed and remounted, riding on a chassis already familiar to mechanics and drivers. The vehicle that resulted was not flawless. Its armor remained thin, its open turret was a liability under shell bursts or in severe weather, and its silhouette was large enough that concealment required effort and luck. Crews often expressed a preference for the speed and nimbleness of the M18 Hellcat, especially in situations where being able to relocate quickly could mean the difference between survival and loss. Yet for a brief, important span of time, the M36 sat at the intersection of what was technically possible, industrially feasible, and tactically desirable. It offered enough firepower to change enemy assumptions, came in sufficient numbers to matter, and arrived early enough to play a meaningful role in the last months of the war in the West. As victory approached and units crossed the Rhine, moved into central Germany, and linked up with Soviet forces coming from the east, many M36 crews had little opportunity to reflect on the larger significance of their vehicles. For them, the end of the war arrived as a series of orders to halt, to occupy, to supervise surrendering units, and eventually, for some, to prepare to go home. The machines that had carried them this far would have other journeys yet. After the celebrations and ceremonies of victory, militaries everywhere entered a different mode: reassessment. In the United States, tank destroyer battalions as a separate branch were gradually phased out. The experiences of the war had shown that while the concept of specialized anti-tank units had some merit, in practice, the need for flexible, well-armed armored formations often blurred the lines between tanks and destroyers. The M36 itself lingered in American service into the early years of the Cold War. In Korea, it appeared again on rugged hills and river crossings, this time facing Soviet-designed T-34-85 tanks in a very different environment. There, its 90mm gun was still effective, but the vehicle as a whole was already showing its age. Newer tanks with fully enclosed turrets and better armor were entering service, and the open-top design that had been an acceptable compromise during World War II felt increasingly out of place. As American units modernized, many M36s were passed on to Allied nations. French forces used them in colonial conflicts, Yugoslavia integrated them into its own armored inventory, and South Korea operated them for years as part of its defensive posture. In some of these armies, the Jackson remained a valued asset well into the 1960s and beyond, a reminder that what begins as a stopgap can have a surprisingly long life in different strategic contexts. One of the longest-serving examples ended up in Taiwan, where it remained in operational reserve into the 1990s before being retired and placed in a museum. Visitors today can walk around it, examine the long 90mm barrel, peer into the open turret, and read small plaques that summarize, in a few sentences, a career that once intersected with some of the fiercest fighting in Europe. Elsewhere, in American museums and on memorial grounds, preserved M36s sometimes still carry painted silhouettes on their gun barrels, small tank shapes marking credited victories, names of crew members stenciled on turret sides. To casual visitors, they are interesting shapes from a past conflict. To those who know the details, they represent a specific moment when technology, training, and opportunity aligned. When historians at the U.S. Army Armor School compiled their detailed study of tank destroyer operations after the war, they devoted significant attention to the M36. They noted its effectiveness against German heavy armor, especially when used from well-prepared positions and at long range. They also recorded an interesting pattern. When crews were given a choice between available vehicles, many expressed a preference for the lighter, faster M18. Speed, it turned out, was often seen as its own kind of protection. The ability to avoid being hit at all sometimes mattered more to crews than the ability to penetrate the heaviest armor at extreme distances. The M36's story, then, is not a simple tale of bigger gun equals better vehicle, but a more nuanced account of trade-offs that commanders and crews navigated under real conditions. From the German perspective, captured in fragments of interviews and surviving reports, the M36 appears less as a specific named threat and more as part of a broader shift in Allied capabilities. Many tank officers did not know the designation M36 at the time. They knew only that at some point, American guns began to reach them farther out than before, and that this change contributed to a growing sense that the balance of the fight had tipped irreversibly. For those individuals, on both sides, the war was not experienced as a clean narrative with clear turning points. It was a chain of long days and short decisions. On the morning near St. Vith, Barr likely did not wake up thinking about aggregated intelligence failures or industrial output curves. He thought about fuel levels, orders, and the route ahead. Early, in his M36, was not trying to conduct an intelligence coup. He was following a set of instructions: use the range of your gun, stay hidden if you can, disrupt the enemy where it matters most. When he gave the quiet order to fire and watched the effects through his periscope, he was focused on immediate tasks, checking for return fire, deciding when to displace, not on the long-term implications of what a previously unknown gun could do at nearly 3,000 yards. And yet, when enough such moments accumulate across a front, they add up. A heavy tank nicknamed for its supposed supremacy loses its sense of total security. A new vehicle that looks ordinary on the outside quietly changes what is possible in battle. Intelligence organizations discover that updating mental models promptly is as important as collecting data. Industrial systems prove that adapting an existing tool can sometimes be as powerful as inventing a completely new one. The M36 Jackson, with its 90mm gun that German planners initially refused to see for what it was, occupied a small but telling corner of that larger picture. It did not win the war by itself. No single weapon did. But for a critical stretch of time, in the autumn and winter of 1944, on ridges and roads from the German border to the Ardennes, It helped close the gap between what American crews needed and what their previous equipment allowed. It shortened some battles, reduced some losses, and forced an opponent already under enormous strain to question assumptions at the worst possible moment. In a way, that may be the most fitting summary. The story of the M36 is not just about a gun that could reach out 3,000 yards and pierce heavy armor. It is about what happens when one side quietly steps into a new reality while the other continues to plan for the old one, and how, in war, that kind of mismatch is often revealed not by grand announcements, but by a single, unexpected hit on a tank whose commander was sure he was safe.